Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture number 12 in the concept series on the idea of media. Most of this lecture I'm going to concentrate on the post-medium condition and contemporary art schools, because the idea that we are in a post-medium condition, that we're after media, comes from the idea that modernism was interested in media, and that for modernism, media was one of the most important guiding ideas of teaching and learning art. So everything after that is imagined, has been imagined as a condition of art after media. So first of all, a bit on media and senses. These two themes have become entangled in contemporary art. First, the idea of media, that is, traditional sets of materials and methods that have been taught individually, painting, sculpture, architecture, and then more recently performance, video, and installation, and others. And senses, sight, hearing, smell, and so on, which are combined in contemporary art. In the art world, the dissolution or the disintegration or the multiplication of media is associated with a renewed interest in new combinations of senses. So a little bit on the historical background of the idea of media. From the Renaissance through the 18th century, there were discussions about fine arts, not media. The fine arts included three that we now call visual arts: painting, sculpture, and architecture were fine arts. So people didn't talk about media back then. The word medium was used in the beginning of the 19th century as a way to talk about varieties of painting and drawing that use different techniques. So lithography, etching, the Conte crayon, and things like that. Those were called media. And then in the mid-20th century, the word medium began to be used for techniques outside painting and drawing. So that list that I have there, lithography, etching, and so on, that's all painting and drawing and printmaking. But in the mid-20th century, medium began to be used more broadly. On the left there, that's from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's definition number 5C for medium. And the current usage there is at the end of that paragraph C, up at the upper left: any raw material or mode of expression used in artistic or creative activity. It's a relatively recent usage, that last one. So it's important to remember the difference between arts and media, as in fine arts, and our current idea of media. And art is a practice that has a history and a critical language. Architecture, for example, has an extensive vocabulary: column, plinth, entablature, cornice, beam. If you study architecture, you learn these as the elements of classical architecture. Painting has an equally large vocabulary, things like figure, ground, and then out of the older tradition, tableau, facture, things that you learn now mostly in art history, but also flatness, frame, fictive space, and so on. And since the 19th century, media have been associated with techniques, and they often borrow their terms from art. So you could see on that tree on the right, that got mangled when I changed software platforms. It was once a nice tree, but anyway, the oldest idea is the art of painting. And then in the 16th century in Italy, drawing was first recognized as an art. No one collected drawings or thought of them as finished artworks or artworks in their own right until the 16th century in Italy. And then from there, things branched and proliferated so that you have a number of things that are painting still around as an art at the top of the tree. So is drawing, the two main branches, but off of them come smaller branches which are now thought of as media. The art historian Carolyn Jones has written a long book on Clement Greenberg, the modernist art critic. Greenberg was the most important critic from around 1960, more or less, to around 1980, more or less. He was interested in the art of painting and also in the medium of painting. He advocated for painters who were committed to the advancement of painting, which meant to him self-referential abstraction. He promoted abstract art, like you see on the cover of her book. Jones argues that that interest was entirely optical, that Greenberg didn't engage politics or gender or ideology, at least not in the ways that we do now. The book's subtitle is Modernism and the Bureaucratization of the Senses, meaning that Greenberg's ideas marginalized other senses in order to privilege the optical. In order to think about painting as a medium and also an art that needed to be carried forward for its own sake in its own terms, he needed to exclude, in Jones's account, other senses in order to privilege the visual, the optical. She ends her book with a chapter on contemporary art, which is about multimedia, post-media art, and also about the uses of senses other than eyesight. So after I talk a bit about the post-medium condition, I want to return to this question of senses and contemporary art. So there's also a history to the idea of media specificity. Media specificity is the expression that's used in Greenberg and since Greenberg for an art practice that is faithful to the strengths and limitations of its given medium. So that as an artist, you think of yourself as exploring the limits of and the potential of, for example, painting. And you're committed to it in the sense that it's like a language that you're learning to speak better and better. So media specificity means that each medium has its own possibilities, its own language, its own dimensions, and you can, as an artist, remain within them. The history of that goes back to an essay by Lessing called the Laocoon, 1766, where he argued that the two arts, as they called them then, painting and poetry, each had their strengths and they shouldn't trespass on each other. So this is before the idea of medium, but it is the origin, or one of the origins, of media specificity. Here he was talking about what I guess you'd call art specificity. So he said painting is about time, and painting is about space, and poetry is concerned with time, and so they each have their own domains. In an essay called Toward a Newer Laocoon, 1940, which is responding in part to Lessing, Greenberg adopts Lessing's idea and he applies it to visual art. That's another issue of the magazine that Greenberg's essay was published in. Greenberg says painting should be abstract, not figurative. So in other words, to be true to its medium at that point in history, painting should be abstract. That was a fairly common argument at the time. And painting should also be self-referential. That is to say, a painting should be about its own support and surface and its flatness and its materials. And that's an idea that's still very much with us, even though it is a modernist idea articulated most famously by Greenberg. So in his account, painting's problems and possibilities are media specific. In the same way as for Lessing, poetry and painting had art-specific issues. Media specificity means that each medium, and therefore each art, has properties, possibilities, and a language that can be studied and carried forward. Postmodernism is sometimes understood as the period after these problems. Sometimes that means media have just proliferated, so we don't count them anymore, and therefore we don't notice each individual medium. And I think more interestingly, it also implies that the idea of individual media no longer matters because media share different characteristics. And to that extent, modern contemporary art really have given up the idea of media specificity. If you feel that you can do many of the same things in many different media, then that feeling is a post-medium feeling. You don't feel like what you need to express what we want to express needs to be expressed in a given medium. That on the screen there is a good book on Greenberg by Thierry Dedouve, who is to Greenberg's right in that photo. There's a resource on media which is online. It was set up by Tom Mitchell at the University of Chicago in what they call the School of Media Theory, which started in 2003, but the thing is still online. There's also a book now, Critical Terms for Media Studies. They took down the entry on medium specificity, which is interesting, but also appropriate because what they're actually doing at this is defining a whole lot of art terms that have to do with questioning and the end of the period of the authority of individual media. Another important source on this is Rosalind Krauss's book called Voyage on the North Sea, Art in the Age of the Post-Medium Condition. Her argument here is that the earlier modernist search for the purity of each medium, the kind of thing that Greenberg was interested in, the essence of painting being self-reflexivity and self-referentiality and so on, that search for the purity of medium has become a search for the nature or pure form of art itself. So it's this difference between this and the idea of multimedia. Multimedia implies that you're combining media, but you do adhere to the idea that the different media you've combined are each separate and have different capacities and different historical trajectories and so on. But in the post-medium condition, it's no longer multimedia, and the reason is, according to Krauss, that we still pursue the same search for the purity of medium, but we broadened it so that we're now looking for what counts as art. At the same time, media continue to exist because they're taught separately in art schools, and it's their difference, their heterogeneity, that makes that purity pretty much impossible. That's the artist Brodtars at his museum, is an example in her book of the post-medium condition. She defines negative and positive ideals for this post-medium condition. Negative ideal is that postmodernism is postmodernism, which includes video installations, intermedia works, spectacles, like Eliasson's artworks. She thinks that that sense of postmodernism fits too neatly with capitalist spectacle, which I defined in the first concepts lecture. In other words, it's too much like advertising. She's skeptical of it's too easy, and it's too much like capitalist imagery. But then there's also a positive direction in which art has gone, which she calls differential specificity. And the idea there is that you make use of outmoded forms along with new ones in order to get a grip on them, not just rehearse them like you would if you were working for an advertising agency. And her example is Brodtars, in particular his Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagles, which you can look up, which is an artwork installation that he did, which used deliberately old-fashioned kinds of display, which you could see a bit of there, along with new ones. There are a number of artists that have done this, which Krauss thinks is a promising direction because it still remembers that media do have their histories, if not anymore entirely their specificities, and that as an artist, it's necessary to try to control them and own them and not be used by them. So she thinks it's no longer sensible to think of working in an art or a medium. Instead, everybody works on or in art in general. Art practice is a common way then for artists to say what they do, as in sentences, my practice is. Practice is a very recent word, and that's coming up in lecture 14. It seems to imply, among other things, that what you do could be done with all or any media. Jones goes in a different direction in her assessment of the contemporary art in relation to its inheritance of modernism at the end of her book. That last chapter of hers, as I said, is about work that involves different senses and especially art that's become synesthetic. So I want to spend a little bit of time on synesthesia. This part of the lecture probably wouldn't be included if this was a lecture series for a university or college. Because talk about media and the post-medium condition and multimedia condition, all that, is usually done without reference to senses. But in contemporary art, synesthesia and sensory experiments are quite common. They're part of the conversation about media. So just on the subject of the senses. Senses have been numbered very differently over time. There's the 5 senses that we all grew up being told there were 5: sight, smell, taste, hearing, touch. But then there are others. There's this quote-unquote 6th sense, which has been identified with vestibular sense. In other words, we sense gravity. You can tell when you're upside down without touching anything. So that's not one of the 5 senses. That would be a 6th sense, vestibular sense. Vestibules in the ears, that refers to. There are also interoceptive senses that sense your body's own condition and its sense of itself. Proprioception was made famous by a book by Oliver Sacks. Proprioception is the body's sense of its internal arrangement of muscles and bones and organs. It was made famous in a book that describes a medical condition in which you can lose your sense of touch, but you can keep your proprioception. So in other words, touch is we sense touch by a whole different set of neurons than we use to sense the inside of our body. So you can, in rare cases, lose your sense of touch. That is, you have no, if you touch something very lightly, you won't feel anything, but you can keep your sense of proprioception, meaning that you can tell the inside of your body, how it's disposed, and vice versa. So you can have a sense of touch, but not a sense of proprioception. I actually had a student at the School of the Art Institute some years ago who had that condition, and she described to all of us how she had to watch how she was sitting to make sure that she hadn't put, say, the leg of the chair onto her foot, make sure that her leg wasn't falling asleep, and she had to learn to walk differently because she had to keep an eye on her body while she was walking because she lacked the inner sense, but she had this light superficial touch. So there are a number of these that have been proposed as interoceptive senses. They sense your body's condition. Some people think they're not senses because none of those in that list that I have under interoceptive, none of those have to do with sensing the outside world. And for some people that is all about what a sense is. But anyway, and then last and maybe most interesting, there are unconscious senses. These are, this is information about the external world that we get, but we're not conscious of it. And I guess the most famous one is our ability to register the existence of pheromones, chemicals that we're not, that don't smell like anything, we can't smell them consciously. But humans do have an organ that senses them. If you want to look it up, there's an essay on the left about that, and there's ongoing research about it. The research was stopped several times because it was regarded with suspicion because perfume companies and others were interested in it to try to find out if they could, get love potions and things like that to sell. So it's had a kind of a difficult history as a scientific inquiry. But at any rate, pheromones, including sex hormones and things like that, would be things that we can, in theory, we sense them, but we're not conscious of it as we sense them. They would have some effect on us, and therefore they could count as a sense. Okay, so anyway, in the art world, these and others are often combined like media. There are a couple of different definitions of synesthesia that are confusing, and I think it's useful to separate them. So there's a medical definition. Synesthesia is a recognized medical condition in which people associate different senses and also associate ideas with senses. There's a neuroscientist, Nikolic, who suggests that synesthesia should be renamed ideasthesia because usually, apparently, people who have this as a medical condition associate ideas with colors and smells. So it's really ideas plus sensory input. And there's a number of different kinds of synesthesia. There is, for example, spatial sequence synesthesia, SSS. This is the only one of them that I have. Some people have things like this where if you think of counting from 1 to 10, no picture may come to your mind, but if some people are asked to count 1 to 10, they use mental pictures like this. I have a small version of this that if you ask me to visualize the month of the year, if I'm counting forward or backward months of the year, I always imagine a circle with January at the bottom. That's a form of spatial sequence synesthesia. I'm associating an image in that case with a sequence in time. Then there's historical synesthesia. That was a very popular theme among fantasiacal artists, meaning the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And probably the most famous example of it in the art world is Kandinsky's book Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And there's the second edition of that book. Kandinsky says, for example, that yellow produces a, quote, prolonged and shrill trumpet note in the ear, that it is sour, terrestrial, eccentric, disturbing, aggressive, and suited to sharp forms. Kandinsky's book is pretty amazing to read because you can, every once in a while, you'll find yourself agreeing with something in it, and the rest of the time you're just thinking, how in the world did you think of that? And why did he really feel it? And so this was not a medical synesthesic condition, but it was a set of beliefs and desires in relation, especially in Kandinsky's case, to colors and shapes in oil painting. And this kind of synesthesia was very common at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century among artists. There are also examples from outside the visual arts. There's a composer named Scriabin who composed a symphony called Prometheus, which is scored for orchestra and, quote, color organ, which is an instrument that would have projected colors representing the piece's harmonies. In that particular case, there's a debate about how to build that color organ, and also a debate about whether Scriabin was a synesthete himself. In other words, did he have the medical condition? And discussion about how in the world he scored these harmonies and so on. But his is not the only example of a color organ. There were a number of attempts at the beginning of the 20th century to build instruments, musical instruments, that would make connections with colors. So all of that is historical synesthesia. It's a phenomenon that's studied by art historians in several arts and largely went away after the 30s. The third aspect of synesthesia is its contemporary revival. It's been revived in the art world and associated with the post-medium condition in different ways, in different combinations. This is one of my favorite scholars on this subject. Klaus Noppene is an historian and scholar of olfactory art, art that uses smells. So this is the kind of research that could, in future, find form into new kinds of media studies. I wanted to emphasize these three definitions or senses of synesthesia because it's sometimes assumed in the art world that the medical condition is common. It's not. And it's also assumed that artists have always been interested in synesthesia. They haven't. So it's something that comes and goes, and it may be in a revival right now or in a new form. So I think it's important to distinguish between people who have medical synesthesia, artists influenced by turn-of-the-century art, and contemporary artists interested in post-medium art. Okay, the last section of this lecture is on contemporary art schools and media. In contemporary art instruction, there are still departments with separate instructors for media. That's RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, on the right from their webpage of their MFA departments. So that's a typical example in a larger art school of the different departments which still specialize in different media. But in large institutions, students are mobile and they don't need to usually pay attention to differences in media. So you could ask about the relation between these departments or media and the contemporary production of art. It's a puzzle from an administrator's and a teacher's point of view how to respond to the post-medium condition when there are still enough individual characteristics and skills involved with media that they really, for practical purposes, they have to be kept in different departments, in different parts of the school, in different buildings, like with ceramics and things like that. It's not an easily resolvable problem because the shape of contemporary art runs right across these categories and even maybe depends on ignoring them. That's one of Rosalind Krauss's points about the post-medium condition. And yet, in an art school, you have to always be thinking about them to some degree, even if you're in a place like the School of the Art Institute and RISD, where you can move between departments. And at the MFA level, you're even allowed, for example, if you do printmaking and you're admitted, you can choose, say, photography as your department in order to see what happens. So mobility is possible, but the structure of the school still seems like a modernist structure. So here are four sometimes overlapping positions on this question of media. They continue to exist, but they're really just technical categories. So if you want to learn video editing, then that's the department, or those are the rooms that you have to go in and take classes there. Or you could say media continue to exist and they bring meanings and histories with them. So multimedia works are potentially heterogeneous. I suppose to be more accurate, I should have said, if your work is multimedia, it is heterogeneous. If it's a post-medium kind of work, then you could imagine it to be much more homogeneous. Or you could say media no longer exist, so artwork crosses and combines freely, mingling new sensory combinations with new materials. And that's the kind of thing that's possible and done in contemporary art. but a little bit more difficult place to get to when you're learning art in an institution that actually has these differences. And last, you could say media no longer exists, but ideas about medium specificity have been transferred onto art in general. That's Rosalind Krauss's idea, in which case your focus is entirely on the larger question, or the really fundamental question, okay, what counts as art altogether in this year at this historical moment?